The year is 1453. A young sultan, barely 21 years old, stands before the largest walls ever built by human hands. Walls that have repelled every army for over 1,000 years. Behind him waits a cannon so massive it takes 60 oxen to move it. Within weeks, the Byzantine Empire, the last living fragment of Rome, will fall, and a new empire will rise to dominate 3 continents for 600 years. This is the story of the Ottomans. How a small band of Turkish warriors on the edge of a collapsing empire built one of history's most powerful states. Why their army struck fear from Vienna to the Indian Ocean, and how a system once admired by all of Europe slowly decayed from within. This is the rise and fall of the Ottoman Empire. In the closing years of the 13th century, the Anatolian Peninsula was a shattered patchwork. The once mighty Seljuk Sultanate of Rum had collapsed under the weight of Mongol invasions, leaving behind a scatter of small Turkish principalities called beyliks, each ruled by a warrior chieftain competing for land, plunder, and prestige. Among these minor states, in the northwestern corner of Anatolia, near the frontier with the weakening Byzantine Empire, a small beylik emerged under a leader named Osman. He was, by later legend, a man of humble origins who claimed descent from the Kayi tribe of the Oghuz Turks. Though the historical record from this earliest period is thin and many details come from chronicles written generations later to legitimize his successors. What is clear is that Osman's principality, founded around 1299, occupied a uniquely advantageous position. It sat directly on the border between the Islamic world and Christian Byzantium, making it a magnet for Ghazi warriors, religious volunteers, nomadic Turkmen, and adventurers eager to wage frontier warfare against the Christian empire next door. This frontier position would define the entire character of the early Ottoman state. Unlike the more established Turkish beyliks further east, which often modeled themselves on Persian Islamic bureaucratic traditions, the Ottomans grew up fighting a live, expanding war against Byzantine territory that was already crumbling from internal strife, civil wars, and the lingering damage of the Fourth Crusade 2 centuries earlier. Osman's forces won a key victory against a Byzantine army near Beyfus in 1302, a battle that signaled to the wider region that this small beylik was a serious military force. From this point, Osman and his successors steadily absorbed Byzantine territory in northwestern Anatolia, often through a combination of military pressure and negotiated surrender, since many Byzantine towns, abandoned by a distant and dysfunctional imperial government, found it more practical to accept Ottoman rule than to endure prolonged sieges. Osman's son, Orhan, continued this expansion with remarkable success. In 1326, after a long siege, the city of Bursa fell to the Ottomans and became their first true capital, a city that would remain symbolically important even after the center of power moved elsewhere. Orhan's reign also saw the Ottomans cross into Europe for the first time. In 1352, taking advantage of a Byzantine civil war in which one claimant to the throne sought Ottoman military assistance, Ottoman troops crossed the Dardanelles and established a foothold at Simp. A few years later, in 1354, an earthquake devastated the nearby fortress town of Gallipoli, and Ottoman forces occupied it, giving them a permanent military base on European soil. This was a turning point of immense historical consequence. The Ottomans were no longer simply an Anatolian frontier principality. They now had a gateway into the Balkans, and they used it. Under Orhan's successor, Murad I, the Ottoman state transformed from a war band into something resembling a true empire. Murad pushed deep into the Balkans, capturing the strategically vital city of Adrianople around 1369, which he renamed Edirne and made his new capital, shifting the empire's center of gravity decisively toward Europe. The conquest of the Balkans brought the Ottomans into direct conflict with the Christian kingdoms of the region, including Serbia, Bulgaria, and Bosnia. The most legendary of these confrontations came in 1389 at the Battle of Kosovo, where Murad's forces met a coalition of Serbian and allied troops led by Prince Lazar. Murad himself was killed during or shortly after the battle, reportedly assassinated by a Serbian noble who infiltrated his camp. But the Ottoman army emerged victorious, and the battle became a foundational myth in Serbian national memory for centuries afterward, even as it confirmed Ottoman dominance over the Central Balkans. It was during this formative period that the Ottomans developed the institutions that would make their empire uniquely durable. Most significant was the devshirme system, a practice of levying Christian boys from the Balkans, converting them to Islam, and training them for either military or administrative service to the Sultan. The most elite product of this system was the Janissary Corps, infantry soldiers who were technically slaves of the Sultan, but who became the most disciplined and feared military force in Europe and the Near East, armed eventually with firearms long before most European armies adopted them at scale. This system meant that the highest offices of the Ottoman state, even the position of Grand Vizier, could be filled by men who began life as Christian peasants, creating a meritocratic elite loyal directly to the Sultan rather than to any hereditary aristocracy. This was radically different from the feudal structures of contemporary Europe and gave the Ottoman state a flexibility and central authority that many of its rivals lacked. Murad's son, Bayezid I, inherited an empire on the rise and pushed it further, earning the nickname Yildirim or Thunderbolt for the speed of his military campaigns. Bayezid besieged Constantinople itself, the dream that had eluded Ottoman rulers for nearly a century, and crushed a major European crusading army at the Battle of Nicopolis in 1396, a force that included French, Hungarian, and other Christian knights who had marched east specifically to stop Ottoman expansion. The victory at Nicopolis sent shockwaves through Christian Europe and seemed to confirm that nothing could stop the Ottoman advance. But Bayezid's ambitions soon collided with a far greater threat from the east. The Central Asian conqueror Timur, known in the West as Tamerlane, was carving his own empire across Persia and Central Asia, and tensions between the two rulers escalated into open war. At the Battle of Ankara in 1402, Timur's forces decisively defeated the Ottoman army, and Bayezid himself was captured, reportedly dying in captivity within months. The defeat at Ankara plunged the Ottoman state into an 11-year civil war known as the Ottoman Interregnum, as Bayezid's sons fought one another for the throne, while the empire's Balkan and Anatolian territories threatened to fragment entirely. This period reveals an important truth about the early Ottoman state. Its rapid expansion had outpaced its institutional consolidation, and only the resilience of the underlying administrative and military systems allowed it to survive what could easily have been a terminal crisis. By 1413, Mehmed I had emerged victorious from the Interregnum, reunifying the Ottoman lands and beginning the slow work of restoring central authority. His son, Murad II, continued this consolidation, defeating renewed crusading efforts at the Battle of Varna in 1444, a battle that effectively ended large-scale Western European crusading efforts against the Ottomans and confirmed that the empire had fully recovered from the catastrophe of Ankara. The stage was now set for the most consequential Ottoman ruler of the 15th century to take the throne and finish what his predecessors had only dreamed of completing. By the time Mehmed II ascended the Ottoman throne for the second and final time in 1451, the conquest of Constantinople had become something close to an obsession for Ottoman rulers, a goal pursued by his great-grandfather and grandfather, but never achieved. Constantinople, by this point, was a shadow of its former imperial glory. Its population had dwindled to perhaps 50,000 people scattered within walls built to hold many times that number. Its treasury was nearly empty, and its territory had shrunk to little more than the city itself and a few scattered outposts. Yet its legendary fortifications, the Theodosian walls, had withstood every siege for over 1,000 years, and the symbolic weight of capturing the seat of the Roman Empire. For Byzantium was, in its own eyes and in the eyes of much of the world, simply the continuation of Rome, made the prize irresistible. Mehmed prepared for the siege with extraordinary thoroughness. He commissioned a Hungarian engineer named Orban to cast massive bronze cannons, including one gigantic gun, sometimes called the Basilica, reportedly capable of firing stone balls weighing hundreds of kilograms, a weapon so large it required dozens of oxen and hundreds of men to transport. He also built a fortress called Rumeli Hizari on the European shore of the Bosphorus, deliberately positioned to control the strait and cut off any potential naval relief from the Black Sea. When the siege began in early April 1453, Mehmed commanded a force historians estimate at somewhere between 50 and 80,000 men, against a defending garrison of only a few thousand Byzantine soldiers and foreign volunteers, most notably a contingent of Genoese troops led by Giovanni Giustiniani. The defenders fought with remarkable tenacity for nearly 2 months, repairing breaches in the walls overnight and repelling repeated assaults. The Byzantine Emperor Constantine XI refused offers of safe passage and chose to remain with his city. In a moment that has become legendary, Mehmed, unable to bring his fleet past a defensive chain blocking the Golden Horde, ordered his ships dragged overland on greased logs around the Byzantine defenses and launched directly into the harbor, a maneuver that stunned the defenders and outflanked one of their key defensive advantages. On the night of May 28th into May 29th, after weeks of bombardment had finally opened breaches in the ancient walls, Mehmed launched a final massive assault. After the elite Janissary Corps broke through near the gate of St. Romanus, panic spread through the defenders. The wall was overrun, and Constantine XI reportedly died fighting in the chaos, his body never definitively identified. By the end of the day, Constantinople had fallen, and with it, the Byzantine Empire, after more than 1,100 years, ceased to exist. Mehmed II, now bearing the title Fadi, meaning the Conqueror, entered the city and immediately set about transforming it into his new imperial capital. He converted the great church of Hagia Sophia into a mosque, a building that had stood as the largest church in Christendom for nearly 1,000 years. Rather than simply plundering and abandoning the city, as some of his advisors urged, Mehmed pursued a deliberate policy of repopulation and reconstruction, inviting Muslims, Christians, and Jews from across his territories to resettle the city, rebuilding its infrastructure, and constructing new mosques, markets, and palaces, including the beginnings of what would become the sprawling Topkapi Palace complex. This pragmatic, multi-ethnic approach to governance became a hallmark of Ottoman imperial administration. Rather than forcibly converting or expelling conquered populations, the Ottomans generally organized non-Muslim subjects into self-governing religious communities called millets, allowing Christians and Jews considerable autonomy over their own religious and legal affairs in exchange for loyalty and taxation. A system that, while never one of full equality, was notably more tolerant than much of contemporary Christian Europe toward religious minorities. The fall of Constantinople reverberated across Europe like an earthquake. It eliminated the last vestige of the Roman Empire, a psychological blow that historians often cite as a symbolic marker for the end of the medieval period itself. It also gave the Ottomans full control over the crucial maritime choke point between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, with enormous consequences for trade routes that had connected Europe to Asia for centuries. Some historians argue that Ottoman control over these eastern trade routes was a contributing factor that pushed European powers like Portugal and Spain to seek alternative sea routes to Asia, indirectly spurring the age of exploration. Though this remains a debated point among scholars who note that Italian merchants continued trading with the Ottomans throughout this period. Mehmed did not stop with Constantinople. He spent the following decades expanding Ottoman control across the Balkans, conquering Serbia, much of Bosnia, and the Peloponnese, while also extending Ottoman authority deeper into Anatolia, absorbing rival Turkish beyliks, and even briefly capturing the Genoese-controlled Crimean port of Kaffa, extending Ottoman influence to the Black Sea's northern shore through a vassal relationship with the Crimean Khanate. He also launched a notable, though ultimately unsuccessful, expedition into southern Italy in 1480, briefly capturing the town of Otranto, an episode that badly frightened the Italian states and the papacy before Ottoman forces withdrew following Mehmed's death in 1481. Mehmed's death triggered a succession struggle between his sons Bayezid II and Sem, a pattern of fratricidal conflict that would recur throughout Ottoman history, since the empire had no fixed law of succession and instead relied on a brutal practical principle in which surviving sons fought for the throne, with the eventual winner often executing his brothers to prevent future civil war. Bayezid II ultimately secured the throne, and while his reign is sometimes characterized as more cautious than his father's, it nonetheless saw continued consolidation, a major naval rivalry with Venice over control of the eastern Mediterranean, and the welcoming of Sephardic Jews expelled from Spain in 1492, many of whom settled in Ottoman cities and contributed significantly to the empire's commercial and intellectual life. It was Bayezid's son, however, who would push the empire to confront a different kind of challenge entirely. Not the crumbling remnants of Byzantium, but a rising and ambitious Persian Safavid state to the east and the vast, unconquered Arab heartlands of Islam to the south. The early 16th century brought the Ottoman Empire into its golden age, a period of expansion, institutional sophistication, and cultural flourishing that made it the most formidable power stretching from the Adriatic to the Persian Gulf. The transformation began under Sultan Selim I, who came to power in 1512 after deposing his own father in a dispute over succession policy, and whose brief but explosive 9-year reign reoriented Ottoman strategic priorities dramatically toward the Muslim world to the south and east. Selim, nicknamed Yavuz, or the Grim, for his ruthlessness, viewed the rising Safavid dynasty in Persia as an existential threat, both because of its growing military power and because the Safavids championed Shia Islam, which Selim and the Sunni Ottoman religious establishment regarded as a dangerous heresy capable of subverting loyalty among his own Anatolian subjects. In 1514, Selim led his army deep into Safavid territory and met Shah Ismail I's forces at the Battle of Calderon. The battle showcased a critical military truth of the era. Ottoman firearms and artillery, organized with disciplined Janissary infantry, proved devastatingly effective against the more traditionally organized Safavid cavalry, which relied heavily on close combat and had not yet adopted gunpowder weapons at comparable scale. The Ottoman victory was decisive, checking Safavid westward expansion permanently and securing eastern Anatolia. Though Selim chose not to pursue a full conquest of Persia, recognizing the logistical difficulty of holding such distant territory. Selim then turned south, where the once dominant Mamluk Sultanate, which had ruled Egypt, Syria, and the holiest cities of Islam for over 2.5 centuries, found itself outmatched by Ottoman military technology. In a rapid campaign between 1516 and 1517, Selim's forces crushed Mamluk armies at the battles of Marj Dabik and Radaniya, conquering Syria, Egypt, and the Hijaz region containing Mecca and Medina. This conquest was transformative for Ottoman identity and legitimacy. With control over the holy cities, Ottoman sultans began to style themselves as protectors of the two holy mosques and increasingly claimed the title of caliph, positioning the Ottoman state as the preeminent power within the Sunni Muslim world, a claim of religious authority that would remain central to Ottoman ideology for the rest of the empire's existence. The conquest also brought enormous new wealth and territory under Ottoman control, including the lucrative spice and pilgrimage trade routes running through the Red Sea. Selim's son, Suleiman I, inherited an empire already vast and wealthy, and over his 46-year reign from 1520 to 1566, he expanded it further while simultaneously building the legal, architectural, and cultural institutions that define the empire's classical age, earning him the title Suleiman the Magnificent in the West and Kinyuni, meaning the lawgiver. Among his own subjects, Suleiman's military campaigns pushed deep into Christian Europe. In 1521, he captured Belgrade, removing a key obstacle to further advance into Hungary. In 1522, his forces took the island of Rhodes after a grueling siege, expelling the Knights Hospitaller who had used it as a base for raiding Ottoman shipping. His most consequential European campaign came in 1526 at the Battle of Mohacs, where Ottoman forces annihilated the Hungarian army, killing the young Hungarian king and effectively ending the independent Kingdom of Hungary, large portions of which would become Ottoman territory or vassal states for the next century and a half. In 1529, Suleiman pushed further still, leading a massive army to besiege Vienna itself, the capital of the Habsburg domains and one of the great cities of Catholic Europe. The siege ultimately failed, hampered by an unusually wet campaign season that delayed the army's advance and made it difficult to bring up heavy artillery before winter approached, forcing Suleiman to withdraw. This failure marked something of a high-water mark for Ottoman expansion into Central Europe, while the Ottomans would launch another major attempt on Vienna over a century and a half later. The empire's western frontier with the Habsburgs would settle into a long, grinding contest of fortress warfare rather than further dramatic conquest. Suleiman's reign was equally significant for what happened away from the battlefield. He oversaw a major reform and codification of Ottoman law, organizing and rationalizing the canon, the body of secular legal codes that operated alongside Islamic Sharia law, covering land tenure, taxation, criminal justice, and provincial administration with a thoroughness that impressed even European observers of the time. He was also a great patron of architecture, and his chief architect, Mimar Sinan, designed some of the most celebrated buildings in Ottoman history, including the Süleymaniye Mosque complex in Istanbul, a structure combining religious, educational, and charitable functions that exemplified the Ottoman ideal of pious public architecture. Ottoman naval power also reached new heights under Suleiman, particularly under the famous Admiral Hayreddin Barbarossa, who extended Ottoman control across much of the North African coast and won a major naval victory over a combined Christian fleet at the Battle of Preveza in 1538, securing Ottoman dominance over the eastern and central Mediterranean for decades. Yet Suleiman's reign also contained the seeds of future instability. His domestic life was marked by intense rivalry within the harem, particularly involving his wife Hurrem Sultan, a former slave of Slavic origin who rose to extraordinary influence over the Sultan and was widely believed, by contemporaries and later historians alike, to have played a role in convincing Suleiman to have his own talented and popular son, Mustafa, executed in 1553 on suspicion of plotting rebellion, clearing the path for Hürrem's own sons to inherit the throne. This episode reflected a broader and increasingly consequential dynamic. As the empire grew larger and more complex, the inner workings of the palace, the harem, and the bureaucracy began to exert as much influence over succession and policy as battlefield success. A shift whose long-term consequences would become starkly apparent in the generations following Suleiman's death in 1566, during yet another military campaign in Hungary. The death of Suleiman the Magnificent in 1566 did not bring immediate collapse, but marked the beginning of a long and uneven transformation in how the Ottoman Empire was governed, one that historians have debated extensively in terms of cause and characterization. The older narrative of a simple, linear Ottoman decline beginning immediately after Suleiman has been substantially revised by modern historians, who point out that the empire remained militarily formidable, economically significant, and territorially expansive for well over a century after his death. Nonetheless, the structural pressures that would eventually erode Ottoman power were already taking shape during this period, even if their full consequences would not be felt for generations. One critical shift involved the sultans themselves. Suleiman's son and successor, Selim II, and many subsequent sultans were less personally involved in military campaigns and day-to-day governance than their predecessors, instead relying increasingly on grand viziers and powerful court factions, including influential women of the imperial harem, to manage state affairs. This was compounded by a change in succession practice. Rather than sending young princes out to govern provinces and gain administrative and military experience, as had been traditional, sultans increasingly confined potential heirs to a secluded section of the palace known as the cage, ostensibly to prevent rebellion, but with the unintended consequence of producing sultans with little practical experience of governance or warfare by the time they inherited the throne. Militarily, the empire continued to demonstrate real strength well into the 17th century. Ottoman forces achieved significant victories, including a long and difficult conquest of Crete from Venice completed in 1669, and in 1683 the empire launched its second and final major attempt to capture Vienna, assembling an enormous army under Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha. The siege came remarkably close to succeeding before a relief force, organized through the Holy League and including a famous cavalry charge by Polish-Lithuanian forces under King John III Sobieski, broke the siege and routed the Ottoman army. The failure at Vienna in 1683 triggered the Great Turkish War, a prolonged conflict against an alliance of Habsburg Austria, Poland, Venice, and Russia that resulted through the Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699 in the Ottomans ceding substantial territory, including most of Hungary, for the first time in the empire's history formally losing significant lands rather than gaining them. A watershed moment that signaled a fundamental shift in the balance of power between the Ottomans and Christian Europe. The 18th and 19th centuries brought mounting pressures from multiple directions simultaneously. Russia emerged as an increasingly dangerous rival, fighting a series of wars with the Ottomans that steadily pushed Ottoman borders back from the Black Sea's northern shores, while Russian rulers, particularly Catherine the Great, also began positioning Russia as a self-declared protector of Ottoman Christian subjects, a claim that provided pretext for repeated intervention in Ottoman internal affairs. Meanwhile, nationalism, a relatively new political force sweeping through Europe in the wake of the French Revolution, proved deeply corrosive to a multi-ethnic empire built on religious rather than national organizing principles. Serbian uprisings in the early 19th century and the Greek War of Independence, which succeeded in establishing an independent Greek state by 1830 with military support from Britain, France, and Russia, demonstrated that subject populations could successfully break away with sufficient external backing, encouraging further nationalist movements among Ottoman Christian populations in the Balkans. Internally, the Ottoman government, recognizing the scale of the challenge, attempted significant reform efforts collectively known as the Tanzimat, beginning in 1839, which sought to modernize the legal system, military, education, and administration along European lines, granting at least nominal legal equality to non-Muslim subjects and attempting to create a more centralized, bureaucratic state capable of competing with European powers. These reforms achieved real but limited success. They modernized aspects of Ottoman governance and infrastructure, but could not fully resolve the empire's fundamental problems of nationalist fragmentation, chronic financial difficulties exacerbated by heavy foreign borrowing, and the political dominance of European powers who increasingly treated Ottoman territory as a matter to be managed in their own strategic interests, a dynamic so pronounced that contemporaries began referring to the empire as the sick man of Europe. The final collapse came through compounding crises in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The Ottomans lost further Balkan territory in wars during 1877 to 78 and again in the Balkan Wars of 1912 to 1913, which stripped away nearly all remaining Ottoman possessions in southeastern Europe within a matter of months. A reform-minded but increasingly authoritarian political movement known as the Young Turks, dominated by the Committee of Union and Progress, seized effective control of the government in the years before World War I, pursuing both modernization and an increasingly narrow Turkish nationalist ideology that proved disastrous for the empire's non-Turkish populations. The fateful decision to enter World War I in 1914 on the side of Germany and Austria-Hungary proved catastrophic. The war brought the empire's resources and infrastructure to the point of collapse, while also providing the context for one of the darkest chapters in Ottoman history, the mass deportation and killing of Armenian civilians beginning in 1915, an event scholars and numerous governments have recognized as genocide, though the issue remains a subject of significant historical and political dispute, particularly within Turkey itself. Ottoman defeat in World War I led to occupation by Allied forces and the humiliating Treaty of Sèvres in 1920, which would have dismantled almost all remaining Ottoman territory entirely. This provoked a nationalist resistance movement led by a former Ottoman military officer named Mustafa Kemal, who organized Turkish forces to fight off Allied-backed occupation, including Greek forces in Anatolia, ultimately securing a far more favorable settlement in the Treaty of Lausanne in 1923. With military and political victory achieved, Mustafa Kemal, who would later take the name Ataturk, formally abolished the Ottoman Sultanate, and shortly afterward the Caliphate as well, establishing the secular Republic of Turkey in its place. The last Ottoman Sultan, Mehmed VI, departed Istanbul aboard a British warship in November 1922, bringing a formal end to a dynasty and an empire that had endured for over 6 centuries, leaving behind a legacy still visible today across the languages, legal systems, architecture, and political boundaries of a vast stretch of territory from the Balkans through the Middle East and North Africa.